If you traveled back to the year 1776, almost nobody would have bet on America. Along the eastern edge of North America sat 13 small colonies. Together, they had fewer than 3 million people. They had no powerful army, no mighty navy, no great industries, no vast fortunes. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire ruled nearly a quarter of the world. France was a global giant. Spain controlled enormous territories. The Dutch dominated international trade. Compared to them, America was barely a footnote. And yet, less than 2 centuries later, the world looked completely different. The United States possessed the largest economy on Earth. Its factories produced more goods than entire continents. Its military reached every ocean. Its currency became the foundation of global trade. Its inventions transformed everyday life. Its companies became household names across the planet. Its influence reached almost every nation. So, how did that happen? How did a fragile collection of colonies defeat the greatest empire of its age, survive civil war, outproduce every rival, win 2 world wars, and emerge as the most powerful nation in modern history? Was it luck? Was it geography? Was it brilliant leadership? Or was it something much bigger? Because the story of America's rise isn't just about battles, it's about land, money, innovation, immigration, natural resources, opportunity, and timing. Perfect timing, but history rarely follows a straight line. America's rise wasn't inevitable. Again and again, the country stood on the edge of collapse. It nearly failed before it truly began. It nearly tore itself apart. It suffered financial disasters, political crises, economic depressions, and wars that threatened its very existence. Any one of those moments could have changed history forever, yet every crisis reshaped the nation instead of destroying it. Each setback became the foundation for the next leap forward. Every generation inherited a stronger country than the one before. Until one day, without most of the world realizing it, a new superpower had quietly taken the throne. This is the story of how America became the most powerful nation on Earth. Chapter 1. A tiny nation. To understand how America became a superpower, you first have to imagine how small it once was. In 1776, the United States didn't exist. There were only 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Together, they occupied a narrow strip of land between the ocean and an enormous, mysterious wilderness. Beyond those settlements lay forests that seemed endless, mountain ranges few Europeans had crossed, powerful native nations that had lived there for centuries, and rivers that disappeared into lands no colonist had ever seen. For most people living in the colonies, the frontier wasn't an opportunity, it was a danger. Life itself was difficult. Most families were farmers. A typical home was built from timber. Roads turned into mud whenever it rained. Traveling just 50 miles could take several days. There was no electricity, no railroads, no factories, no modern medicine. A poor harvest could mean hunger. A harsh winter could mean death. The colonies depended heavily on Britain. British ships carried goods across the Atlantic. British soldiers defended the colonies during major wars. British merchants controlled much of international trade, and British laws governed everyday life. For many years, that arrangement worked, until one problem changed everything: money. Fighting global wars had left Britain buried in debt. Someone had to pay the bill. The colonies seemed like the obvious choice. New taxes appeared: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. To many people in Britain, these taxes were reasonable. After all, British troops had helped defend the colonies. Why shouldn't the colonists contribute? But many Americans saw the situation differently. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. They had no voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The phrase that spread from town to town was simple: no taxation without representation. It became far more than a political slogan. It became a challenge to imperial authority. Tensions grew. Arguments became protests. Protests became riots. Then came one shipment of tea that changed history forever. In December 1773, a group of colonists disguised themselves and boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. Instead of stealing the cargo, they threw hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The message was unmistakable. The colonies would no longer accept Britain's control without resistance. London responded with punishment. The port of Boston was closed. Massachusetts lost many of its rights. British troops increased their presence, but instead of frightening the colonies into submission, the punishment united them. Colonies that had once argued with one another now found a common cause: merchants, farmers, lawyers, printers, craftsmen. They began thinking of themselves not simply as Virginians or New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians, but as Americans. Still, few believed they could actually defeat the greatest empire on earth. Britain possessed the world's most powerful navy. Its army was experienced. Its economy dwarfed that of the colonies. On paper, the coming conflict looked hopeless, but history is rarely decided on paper. Sometimes the stronger army loses. Sometimes distance becomes a weapon. Sometimes a determined population can outlast an empire. And sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable. In April 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. No one knew it then, but those gunshots marked the beginning of a revolution that would reshape not only America, but the entire world. Chapter 2. Winning the Impossible. On paper, the war should have been over before it began. Britain had the world's most powerful navy. Its army was one of the best trained on earth. It possessed experienced generals, a global empire, and enormous financial resources. The colonies had almost none of those advantages. The Continental Army was small. Many soldiers owned no proper uniforms. Some fought with worn-out boots. Others marched barefoot, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Food was scarce. Gunpowder was limited. Many recruits had never fired a musket before. Even the idea of becoming an independent nation seemed unrealistic. So why did they keep fighting? Because they believed they weren't just defending land. They were defending an idea, that governments should answer to the people, not the other way around. It was a dangerous idea, and if they failed, many of the revolution's leaders could be executed for treason. One man carried more of that burden than anyone else: George Washington. He wasn't the greatest battlefield commander of his generation. He knew it. His officers knew it. But Washington understood something even more important. He didn't have to win every battle. He simply had to keep the army alive. Every day the Continental Army survived. Britain spent more money, more supplies, more ships, more soldiers. The war became a slow drain on the world's largest empire. Then came one of the darkest moments of the Revolution, the winter of 1777. Valley Forge. The freezing camp became a test of survival more than combat. Thousands of soldiers endured bitter cold. Disease spread rapidly. Food ran dangerously low. Many lacked blankets. Many lacked shoes. Some died without ever seeing another battle. From the outside, it looked like the revolution was collapsing. But something remarkable happened. Instead of abandoning the cause, the army became stronger. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben introduced disciplined military training. He taught soldiers how to march together, fire together, reload faster, fight as one. By the time spring arrived, the Continental Army was no longer a collection of volunteers. It was becoming a professional fighting force. Meanwhile, Britain faced a problem it hadn't expected: distance. Every cannon, every musket, every barrel of food had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Months could pass before supplies arrived. Storms delayed ships. Privateers attacked convoys. Communication was painfully slow. A decision made in London might not reach America for weeks. The colonies, despite their weaknesses, had one enormous advantage: they were fighting at home. Then came the turning point. In October 1777, British General John Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga. The victory shocked Europe. For the first time, foreign governments believed Britain might actually lose. one country paid especially close attention: France, Britain's longtime rival. The French saw an opportunity. If America won, Britain would grow weaker, so France made a decision that changed history. It recognized the United States as an independent nation. Then it sent money, weapons, soldiers, warships. Without French support, the revolution might have failed. With it, the balance of power shifted. 4 years later, British General Charles Cornwallis marched his exhausted army into Yorktown, Virginia. American troops surrounded the city. French warships blocked escape by sea. There was nowhere left to run. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The fighting would continue for a time, but the outcome was now unavoidable. The impossible had happened. A collection of small colonies had defeated the greatest empire in the world. The victory stunned kings, alarmed emperors, and inspired revolutionaries across the globe. But independence solved only one problem. The new nation was free. It was also poor, deeply divided, heavily in debt. Its government was weak. Its future was uncertain. Winning the revolution had created a country. Keeping that country alive would prove to be an even greater challenge, because the greatest advantage America possessed wasn't its army, it wasn't its leaders, it wasn't even its victory. It was something stretching far beyond the horizon, millions of square miles of untapped land waiting to change history. Chapter 3: A Continent of Opportunity. Winning independence gave America its freedom. But freedom alone doesn't make a nation powerful. The United States still faced enormous problems. Its economy was fragile, its government was new, its military was small. Many European leaders believed the country wouldn't survive another generation. They were wrong. Not because America was stronger than Europe, but because it possessed something Europe could never create: space. An almost unimaginable amount of it. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains stretched forests, grasslands, great rivers, and fertile soil that seemed to go on forever. To many Americans, the West represented hope. To many native nations who already lived there, it represented an existential threat. The story of America's expansion is therefore one of opportunity for some and devastating loss for others. As settlers moved west, native communities were displaced through warfare, broken treaties, forced removals, and disease. Entire societies were transformed or destroyed. This difficult history is inseparable from the country's rise. While the nation expanded geographically, its leaders were thinking strategically. In 1803, an opportunity appeared that almost seemed too good to be true. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, controlled an enormous territory known as Louisiana. It stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It covered roughly 828,000 square miles. President Thomas Jefferson wanted to buy one thing: the port of New Orleans. Control of that city meant control of trade along the Mississippi River. Instead, Napoleon offered to sell the entire territory for $15 million. Jefferson could hardly believe it. The purchase doubled the size of the United States overnight. No war, no invasion. Just a single agreement that changed the map of North America forever. It remains one of the most significant land purchases in history. But owning land and understanding it were two different things. To discover what they had acquired, Jefferson sent two explorers west, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their journey would become one of the greatest expeditions in American history. For more than 2 years, they crossed mountains, navigated rivers, met dozens of native nations, recorded unfamiliar plants and animals, and mapped territories few Americans had ever seen. Their reports painted a picture of extraordinary possibility. The continent was rich, exceptionally rich. There were forests that could supply timber for generations, rivers that connected distant regions, coal buried beneath the ground, iron waiting to be mined, and farmland capable of feeding millions. Geography was becoming one of America's greatest advantages. Unlike many European nations, The United States had vast internal waterways that made transporting goods cheaper and faster. Farmers could move crops, factories could receive raw materials, cities could grow around rivers and ports. As transportation improved, the economy accelerated. Then came another force that transformed the nation: immigration. Throughout the 19th century, millions of people crossed the Atlantic. Some fled famine, others escaped persecution. Many simply wanted a chance to build a better life. They arrived with different languages, different religions, and different traditions, but they shared one powerful ambition: opportunity. They built railroads, worked in factories, started businesses, farmed the frontier, and helped turn a young republic into a rapidly expanding economy. The population exploded. More people meant more workers meant more production created more wealth, and more wealth attracted even more immigrants. It became a cycle of extraordinary growth. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had become one of the world's fastest growing nations. But success came with a dangerous contradiction. As new territories joined the Union, one question followed them: would slavery be allowed there? Every new state threatened to upset the balance between free states and slave states. Political compromises delayed the conflict, but they could not eliminate it. The country was growing wealthier. It was also growing more divided. One half of the nation depended on an economy built around enslaved labor. The other was rapidly industrializing. Two different visions of America were emerging. Eventually, those visions would collide, not in Congress, not in the courts, but on the battlefield. The nation that had defeated the British Empire was now preparing to fight itself. Chapter 4. The War That Nearly Destroyed America. By 1860, the United States had become larger, richer, and more influential than anyone had imagined just a few generations earlier. But beneath that success, a fracture had been growing for decades. It wasn't simply a disagreement over politics, or taxes, or states' rights. At its core, the nation was divided over one question: could slavery continue to exist in a country founded on the idea that all people were created equal? For decades, Congress had postponed the argument. Compromises were negotiated. Lines were drawn across maps. New states entered the Union one by one. Each decision bought a little more time, but time was running out. Then, in November 1860, the country elected a new president, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. To many in the South, that was enough. Even before he took office, 7 southern states announced they were leaving the Union. Soon, 4 more would follow. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America. The United States was no longer united. Then came the first shots. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Within days, the Civil War had begun. Both sides believed the conflict would be short. Both sides were wrong. What followed became the deadliest war in American history. Brother fought brother. Neighbor fought neighbor. Entire communities were divided. Families found themselves wearing different uniforms. The battles grew larger than anything North America had ever seen. Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, names that would become etched into history. The technology of war had changed faster than military tactics. Accurate rifles, powerful artillery, railroads, telegraphs, ironclad warships. The result was devastating. Soldiers charged across open fields, only to be cut down in minutes. Entire regiments disappeared in a single afternoon. By the time the war ended, around 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers are estimated to have died, with modern research suggesting the true toll may have been closer to the higher end of that range. No previous American conflict came close. Yet even in the middle of unimaginable destruction, something extraordinary was happening. The North wasn't just fighting a war. It was building an industrial machine. Factories expanded at remarkable speed. steel production increased, railroads multiplied, telegraph lines stretched across the country. Banks financed enormous military operations. Mass production became a necessity. The war accelerated America's industrial revolution. Meanwhile, President Lincoln made a decision that changed the meaning of the conflict forever. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be free. The proclamation did not immediately end slavery everywhere, but it transformed the war. The Union was now fighting not only to preserve the nation, but also to destroy slavery. It also discouraged European powers from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. The conflict became tied to a larger moral cause. Then, in July 1863, everything changed. At Gettysburg, for 3 days, more than 160,000 soldiers fought across the hills and fields of Pennsylvania. The battle ended with a Union victory. General Robert E. Lee's army retreated. It would never again launch a major invasion of the North. Many historians consider Gettysburg the turning point of the war. Less than 2 years later, Confederate resistance collapsed. On April 9, 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was over. The Union had survived. Slavery would soon be abolished throughout the United States with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. But victory came at an enormous cost. Cities had been destroyed, railroads torn apart, farms burned. Hundreds of thousands of families mourned loved ones who would never return. And then, only 5 days after the war effectively ended, another tragedy struck. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated while attending a play in Washington, D.C. The nation had preserved its union, but it had lost the man who guided it through its darkest chapter. Still, out of the devastation emerged something entirely new. The federal government had grown stronger. Industry had become more powerful than ever. Railroads now linked distant regions. Factories were operating on an unprecedented scale. The United States had learned how to mobilize millions of people, coordinate vast resources, and produce weapons, supplies, and machinery faster than almost any nation on Earth. Those skills would not disappear when peace returned. They would fuel an explosion of economic growth unlike anything the world had ever seen. Within a generation, America would produce fortunes so vast that they would create the first billion-dollar corporations and some of the richest individuals in human history. Chapter 5. The Age of Industry. When the Civil War ended, America didn't simply begin rebuilding, it began accelerating. The smoke that once rose from battlefields now rose from factories. Across the country, steel mills burned day and night. Railroads stretched toward the horizon. New cities appeared almost overnight, and millions of people believed the future had finally arrived. The late 19th century became one of the greatest economic transformations in history. For centuries, the world's wealthiest nations had been found in Europe. Britain ruled the seas, France shaped culture, Germany led scientific innovation. But across the Atlantic, a new industrial giant was awakening. The United States possessed something few nations could match. It had abundant coal, vast reserves of iron ore, growing oil fields, millions of acres of farmland, navigable rivers, an expanding railroad network, and perhaps most importantly, an endless supply of workers. Every year, ships arrived carrying immigrants from Europe and beyond. Some escaped famine, some fled persecution, others came chasing a dream. They found work laying railroad tracks, mining coal, pouring steel, building bridges, operating machines. Their labor helped transform the American economy. The symbol of that transformation was the railroad. By the 1880s, steel tracks connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Goods that once took months to transport could now cross the continent in days. Farmers reached distant markets. Factories received raw materials faster than ever. Entire towns sprang up alongside the tracks. For the first time, America truly functioned as one connected economy. Then came steel. One man understood its importance better than anyone else: Andrew Carnegie. Born into a poor family in Scotland, Carnegie immigrated to America as a child. He began working in a textile factory, then as a telegraph messenger, but he believed the future belonged to steel. Railroads needed it, bridges needed it, skyscrapers would soon need it. By investing in the latest manufacturing techniques, Carnegie built one of the largest steel companies in the world. His mills produced steel faster, cheaper, and in greater quantities than almost anyone else. Soon, American steel was helping build cities around the globe. Another entrepreneur saw opportunity beneath the ground: John D. Rockefeller. The discovery of oil changed everything. At first, most people wanted it for one reason: lighting. Kerosene lamps illuminated homes and businesses long before electricity became common. Rockefeller realized that refining oil efficiently mattered more than simply drilling for it. Through relentless organization, cost-cutting, and business expansion, his company, Standard Oil, came to dominate the industry. At its peak, it refined the vast majority of America's oil. His methods remain controversial. Supporters praised his efficiency. Critics argued he crushed competitors and accumulated too much market power. Both views helped shape the modern debate over big business. Another financier rarely built factories himself. Instead, he financed them. J.P. Morgan. Morgan helped reorganize struggling railroads, supported major industrial companies, and stabilized financial markets during periods of crisis. His influence became so great that at times governments relied on his banking network to restore confidence. Together, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and many other industrialists reshaped the American economy. They created enormous wealth, but they also exposed deep inequalities. Factory workers often labored 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Safety standards were poor. Children worked in mines and mills. Industrial accidents were common. Strikes erupted across the country as workers demanded higher wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. America was becoming richer, but prosperity was not shared equally. Despite those challenges, innovation continued. In 1879, Thomas Edison demonstrated a practical incandescent light bulb. Soon, electric power began replacing gas lamps. Factories could operate longer. Cities became brighter. Everyday life started changing after sunset. Then another invention transformed communication: Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. For the first time, a voice could travel instantly across great distances. Business moved faster. Information spread more quickly. The country became more connected. And then, at the beginning of the 20th century, one man revolutionized manufacturing itself: Henry Ford. Automobiles already existed, but they were expensive. Only the wealthy could afford them. Ford believed that ordinary workers should own cars too. His solution wasn't a better automobile, it was a better way to build one: the moving assembly line. Instead of workers walking around a vehicle, the vehicle came to them. Each person repeated one specialized task, again and again and again. Production became dramatically faster. Costs fell, prices dropped. Millions of Americans could suddenly buy an automobile. The Model T changed more than transportation. It changed where people lived, how they traveled, how businesses operated, how cities expanded. By the early 20th century, the United States was producing astonishing quantities of steel, coal, oil, machinery, and manufactured goods. Its factories outpaced many of Europe's industrial powers. Its economy was rapidly becoming the largest in the world. But just as America reached new heights, a conflict erupted thousands of miles away. A war that began in Europe would eventually pull the United States onto the global stage. And after that, the world would never be the same. Chapter 6. A World at War. At the beginning of the 20th century, most Americans believed the Atlantic Ocean was their greatest protection. Europe had spent centuries fighting wars. Empires rose, empires collapsed, borders changed with astonishing regularity. But the United States was different. Separated by thousands of miles of ocean, many believed America could avoid the conflicts of the Old World. For a time, they were right. Then, on June 28, 1914, a single gunshot echoed through the streets of Sarajevo. An Austrian archduke was assassinated. What seemed like a regional crisis quickly spiraled into something far larger. Europe was bound together by alliances. If one nation entered the war, others were pulled in. Within weeks, the continent was on fire. Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. Millions of soldiers marched to the front, convinced the war would end by Christmas. Instead, it became one of the bloodiest conflicts humanity had ever witnessed. Across Western Europe, armies dug hundreds of miles of trenches. Machine guns dominated the battlefield. Artillery shells rained down for days at a time. Poison gas drifted across no man's land. Entire offensives gained only a few hundred yards at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. From across the Atlantic, America watched. President Woodrow Wilson urged neutrality. Most citizens wanted nothing to do with Europe's war, but neutrality became harder to maintain. American factories supplied food, steel, weapons, and financial loans to the Allied powers. Business boomed. While Europe destroyed its industries, American factories ran at full capacity. Banks in New York financed governments that had once borrowed almost exclusively from London. The flow of global wealth was beginning to shift. Then, Germany made a dangerous gamble. Its navy launched unrestricted submarine warfare. German U-boats attacked ships crossing the Atlantic, including vessels carrying American passengers and cargo. Public opinion began to change. Then British intelligence intercepted a secret diplomatic message, the Zimmermann telegram. Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico. If the United States entered the war, Germany suggested Mexico could recover territories it had lost decades earlier. When the message became public, outrage spread across America. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. At first, America's army was relatively small, but the nation's industrial strength told a different story. Factories increased production almost overnight. Shipyards launched transport vessels at unprecedented speed. Railroads carried supplies across the country with remarkable efficiency. Millions of men were trained, equipped, and transported across the Atlantic. The same industrial machine that had transformed the American economy now fueled a modern army. When fresh American troops arrived in Europe, the balance began to change. The Allies regained momentum. Germany, exhausted by years of fighting, could no longer sustain the war. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The First World War had ended. More than 16 million people had lost their lives. Entire regions of Europe lay in ruins. Empires that had dominated the continent for centuries had disappeared. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, all were transformed or gone. The United States emerged from the war very differently. Unlike Europe, its cities had not been bombed, its factories had not been destroyed, its farmland remained productive. Its industries had expanded dramatically. Its banks had become creditors to much of the world. For generations, European nations had financed global commerce. Now, many of them owed enormous debts to American lenders. New York began challenging London as the financial capital of the world. The dollar grew stronger. American companies expanded internationally. The country's influence reached farther than ever before. But success brought confidence. Confidence became speculation. Speculation became excess. Throughout the 1920s, the stock market soared, businesses expanded, consumer spending exploded. Easy credit encouraged Americans to buy homes, cars, and household appliances. The decade became known as the Roaring Twenties. It felt as though prosperity would never end. But beneath the excitement, a dangerous bubble was forming. Banks took greater risks. Investors borrowed heavily to buy stocks. Prices climbed faster than the real economy could support. Few believed the boom could end. Almost no one imagined how quickly it would collapse. When it finally did, the consequences would shake not only America, but the entire world. And the greatest economic crisis in modern history was about to begin. Chapter 7: The Great Depression. In the summer of 1929, America looked unstoppable. The economy was booming. Factories were producing at record levels. New skyscrapers stretched into the sky. Automobiles filled the roads. Electricity reached more homes every year. For millions of Americans, the future seemed brighter than ever, and nowhere was that optimism more visible than on the stock market. Ordinary people poured their savings into stocks. Some borrowed money to buy even more. Prices climbed higher, then higher still. Many believed the market could only go in one direction, up. But beneath the surface, the foundations were beginning to crack. Companies became wildly overvalued. Banks made risky loans. Investors bought shares with borrowed money, hoping prices would continue to rise. It was a gamble, one that worked until it didn't. On October 24, 1929, panic hit Wall Street. Investors rushed to sell. Prices collapsed. 5 days later, on October 29, known forever as Black Tuesday, the market crashed. Billions of dollars in wealth disappeared, almost overnight. At first, many believed the damage would be temporary. It wasn't. Banks began to fail. Thousands closed their doors. Families who had trusted them with life savings lost everything. Businesses couldn't get loans. Factories reduced production. Then they shut down completely. Workers were laid off by the millions. By 1933, about 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. Across the country, people stood in long lines for bread and soup. Families lost their homes. Some lived in makeshift communities built from scrap wood and metal. These settlements became known as Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the crisis. The suffering reached far beyond America's cities. On the Great Plains, nature delivered another devastating blow. Years of drought, combined with poor farming practices, turned fertile fields into clouds of dust. Powerful storms swept across entire states. Crops failed, livestock died. Thousands of farming families abandoned their land. The disaster became known as the Dust Bowl. For many Americans, it felt as though the country was collapsing. Then, in 1933, a new president took office, Franklin D. Roosevelt. His message was simple: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Those words alone could not rebuild the economy, but they restored something equally important: hope. Roosevelt launched an ambitious series of programs known as the New Deal. The federal government hired millions of unemployed Americans. They built roads, bridges, schools, dams, parks, airports, projects that would serve the country for decades. New laws strengthened banks. Financial markets faced stricter regulation. Social Security was introduced to support older Americans. The relationship between citizens and the federal government changed dramatically. Recovery was slow, painfully slow. Even by the end of the 1930s, the economy had not fully returned to its former strength. Then, events unfolding thousands of miles away would change everything. Across Europe, a new dictator had come to power. In Asia, Imperial Japan was expanding through military conquest. The world was once again moving toward war. At first, America wanted no part of it. The memories of the First World War were still fresh. Most citizens believed another European conflict should remain Europe's problem, but history had other plans. On the morning of December 7, 1941, hundreds of Japanese aircraft appeared over the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Their target, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor. Within hours, battleships burned. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. More than 3,400 Americans had been killed. The attack shocked the nation. The debate over entering the war ended instantly. The United States was going to fight, and this time its industrial power, its scientific innovation, and its economic strength would be unleashed on a scale the world had never witnessed. The Great Depression had nearly broken America, but the war that followed would transform it into the most powerful nation on earth. Chapter 8: The Arsenal of Democracy. On December 8, 1941, just one day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress. He called it a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fighting a global conflict across two vast oceans. The challenge was unlike anything the nation had ever faced. Millions of soldiers had to be recruited, fed, trained, armed, and transported across the world. The task seemed almost impossible. But America possessed one advantage that no other nation could match: its factories. Before the war, many factories produced refrigerators, automobiles, and household appliances. Now, they switched almost overnight. Car factories began producing tanks, typewriter factories built rifles, shipyards launched destroyers and aircraft carriers. Aircraft factories operated around the clock. Workers labored day and night. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on industrial jobs, while millions of men served overseas. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of that effort. Across the country, assembly lines never seemed to stop. By the end of the war, the United States had built astonishing quantities of military equipment, hundreds of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, countless trucks, warships, submarines, weapons, and billions of rounds of ammunition. The country became known as the Arsenal of Democracy. It wasn't just supplying its own military. Through the Lend-Lease program, America also sent weapons, vehicles, food, and supplies to allied nations fighting around the world. Industrial strength had become a weapon in itself. Meanwhile, American scientists were racing to solve another problem, one that could change warfare forever. In absolute secrecy, the US government launched the Manhattan Project. It brought together some of the world's leading physicists, engineers, and mathematicians. Their mission was simple to describe, but almost unimaginable to achieve: unlock the power of the atom. After years of research, they succeeded. In July 1945, the world's first nuclear device was tested in the New Mexico desert. Less than a month later, atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was unprecedented. The bombings remain among the most controversial events in modern history. Supporters argue they helped bring the war to a quicker end and avoided an invasion that could have cost countless additional lives. Critics argue the human cost was catastrophic and continue to debate whether their use was necessary. What is beyond dispute is that nuclear weapons changed international politics forever. On September 20, 1945, Japan formally surrendered. The Second World War was over. The numbers were staggering. More than 60 million people had died worldwide. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Much of Europe's infrastructure lay in ruins. Large parts of Asia had been devastated. But once again, the American mainland had escaped widespread destruction. Its factories were intact. Its farms remained productive. Its workforce was experienced. Its industries were larger than ever. By the end of the war, the United States accounted for an extraordinary share of the world's industrial output. No nation came close. America didn't just possess military power, it possessed economic power, financial power, scientific power, and technological power. Recognizing that peace required stable international institutions, leaders from 44 nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944. They designed a new international financial system. The US dollar became the central currency of global finance, backed by gold under the Bretton Woods arrangement. Two new institutions also emerged from those agreements: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both reflected America's growing influence in shaping the post-war economic order. Then came another remarkable decision. Rather than punish every defeated nation economically, the United States invested billions of dollars to help rebuild Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. Factories reopened, roads were rebuilt, trade recovered. The policy strengthened allies, expanded markets for American goods, and helped stabilize regions devastated by war. By the late 1940s, the balance of global power had shifted dramatically. Britain remained influential, but its empire was shrinking. France was rebuilding. Germany was divided. Japan was recovering. The Soviet Union had emerged as a military giant. Only one nation combined unmatched industrial production, a powerful navy, a rapidly expanding air force, global financial influence, and the world's strongest economy, the United States. Yet victory brought a new challenge. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany quickly fell apart. Former allies became rivals. The world would now be divided into two competing camps: capitalism and communism. Neither side wanted another world war, but both prepared for one. The next conflict would not be fought mainly with armies crossing borders. It would be fought through spies, proxy wars, nuclear weapons, technology, and a race to shape the future of humanity. The Cold War had begun. Chapter 9: The American Century. When the Second World War ended, many hoped the world had finally seen its last great conflict. Instead, a different kind of war began. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought on the same side against Nazi Germany. Now, they stood on opposite sides of an ideological divide. One championed democracy and capitalism. The other promoted communism under a one-party state. Neither wanted a direct military confrontation. The consequences were simply too dangerous. Both nations now possessed nuclear weapons. A war between them could destroy civilization itself. So the conflict took a different form. It became known as the Cold War. Instead of fighting each other directly, the two superpowers competed for influence across the globe. They supported rival governments, funded proxy wars, built intelligence networks, developed increasingly powerful weapons, and raced to prove that their system offered the better future. The competition reached into every corner of society: science, technology, education, sports, even space. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. For many Americans, it was a wake-up call. If the Soviets could send a satellite into orbit, could they also send nuclear missiles across continents? The United States responded with massive investments in science and engineering. Schools emphasized mathematics, universities expanded research, new government agencies funded technological innovation. Then, in 1958, NASA was created. What followed became one of history's greatest technological competitions, the space race. For years, the Soviet Union achieved milestone after milestone: the first satellite, the first animal in orbit, the first human in space. The pressure on the United States grew. Then, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy made an extraordinary promise. America would land a man on the moon before the decade ended. At the time, it sounded almost impossible. Yet 8 years later, On July 20, 1969, millions of people around the world watched as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. His words became legendary. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The moon landing was more than a scientific achievement. It demonstrated American technological capability, industrial capacity, and political determination. Meanwhile, the American economy continued expanding. New industries emerged: computers, semiconductors, commercial aviation, telecommunications. Silicon Valley began evolving into a center of innovation that would eventually transform the global economy. American companies became international giants. Products designed in the United States reached consumers on every continent. Movies produced in Hollywood shaped popular culture worldwide. American music, fashion, and television spread across borders. Power was no longer measured only by armies. It was also measured by ideas, brands, technology, and culture. But the Cold War was never without danger. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. The Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 tense days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the edge of catastrophe. Nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, brought the superpowers into direct confrontation. A single mistake, a misunderstood order, or one impatient commander could have changed human history forever. Fortunately, diplomacy prevailed. The missiles were withdrawn. War was avoided. The Cold War continued, but both sides better understood the devastating consequences of direct conflict. As the decades passed, the Soviet economy struggled to keep pace. Maintaining a global military presence, supporting allied governments, and competing technologically placed enormous pressure on its resources. Meanwhile, the United States benefited from a dynamic private sector, constant innovation, and deep financial markets. Its universities attracted talented researchers from around the world. Its companies pioneered personal computers, software, and eventually the Internet. By the late 1980s, change swept across Eastern Europe. Communist governments collapsed one after another. Then, in November 1989, crowds gathered around a concrete barrier that had divided Berlin for nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall. People climbed onto it, hammered away pieces, celebrated together. The wall that had symbolized the Cold War was falling. 2 years later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War was over. For the first time in modern history, the United States stood as the world's only superpower. Its military operated on a global scale. Its economy was the largest on Earth. Its currency served as the backbone of international trade. Its universities ranked among the world's best. Its technology companies were redefining communication, commerce, and information itself. Came the Internet revolution. Companies founded in garages, dorm rooms, and small offices grew into some of the largest businesses in history. Digital technology connected billions of people. American innovation once again reshaped the global economy, but history never stops. The 21st century brought new challenges: the attacks of September 11, long wars in the Middle East, the global financial crisis of 2008, the rapid rise of China, advances in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and new geopolitical competition. America remained enormously powerful, but it was no longer operating in a world where its leadership went unquestioned. Today, the United States continues to lead in many areas: innovation, higher education, finance, entertainment, scientific research, military capability. Yet every generation faces the same question: how does a nation remain powerful in a world that never stops changing? Perhaps that is the most important lesson in America's story. Because becoming a superpower is one achievement, remaining one is another entirely. The rise of the United States was never the result of a single battle. a single president, or a single invention. It was shaped by geography, natural resources, immigration, innovation, entrepreneurship, democratic institutions, industrial strength, and the ability, again and again, to adapt after moments of crisis. Its history contains remarkable achievements. It also contains profound contradictions and painful chapters. Both are part of the same story. Understanding how America became a superpower is not about celebrating every decision or condemning every mistake. It is about recognizing how economics, politics, technology, culture, and human ambition combined to reshape the modern world. Because whether admired, criticized, or challenged, few nations have influenced the course of history as deeply as the United States, and the next chapter is still being written.